Most people learn about the Atlantic slave trade in school. They hear that millions of Africans were taken across the Atlantic Ocean, that slavery was brutal, and that it lasted for centuries. But that version is often simplified. It focuses on dates and numbers, without fully explaining how the system actually worked, who benefited from it, or how deeply it shaped the modern world. Because the truth is, the Atlantic slave trade was not just a tragic event in history. It was one of the largest and most organized systems of forced migration and exploitation the world has ever seen. Welcome to Dark History Files. History they never told you. Over 12 million Africans were captured and transported across the Atlantic. Millions more died before they ever reached the ships. And this didn't happen randomly. It was driven by economics. It was sustained by global demand. And it was protected by powerful institutions. To understand it properly, we have to go beyond the simplified version. We have to start before the ships arrived. Before Europeans began transporting millions of Africans across the Atlantic, West Africa was already home to complex and well-developed societies. This is one of the most important things that often gets left out. Africa was not a continent of scattered, undeveloped groups waiting to be discovered. It had powerful kingdoms, structured governments, and long-standing trade networks. Empires such as Mali, Songhai, Benin, and Congo controlled large territories and had organized political systems. They managed trade, enforced laws, and maintained diplomatic relationships with neighboring regions. Some cities became major centers of learning and commerce. For example, Timbuktu was known for its scholars and libraries, attracting students from different parts of the world. Trade routes connected West Africa to North Africa and beyond. Goods like gold, salt, ivory, and textiles were exchanged across long distances. So Africa was not isolated. It was actively participating in regional and international trade. Now, it's also true that forms of slavery existed within Africa before Europeans arrived. But this is where an important distinction needs to be made. Slavery in many African societies was not based on race. It was often linked to war, debt, or punishment. In some cases, enslaved people could eventually gain freedom, marry into communities, or become part of the society they lived in. This doesn't mean it was fair or harmless, but it was not the same as the system that would later develop in the Atlantic world. What Europeans introduced was different. It was racial. It was permanent. And it treated human beings as property in a much more rigid and dehumanizing way. When Portuguese traders first arrived on the West African coast in the 15th century, they initially came to trade goods. They exchanged items like textiles, alcohol, and metal products with African leaders. At this stage, African rulers still had control over their territories and negotiated trade on their own terms. But over time, the nature of this trade began to change. European demand for labor in the Americas started to grow rapidly. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas required large numbers of workers. And instead of relying on local populations or paid labor, European powers increasingly turned to enslaved Africans. This is the turning point, because once the demand for enslaved labor increased, the scale of the system expanded dramatically. What started as trade would become something much larger, a transatlantic system built on the buying and selling of human beings. By the 16th century, the Atlantic slave trade had become more than occasional exchange. It had become a system, a highly organized international business involving European powers, African intermediaries, and American colonies. At the center of the system was what historians call the triangular trade. It connected three regions, Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Here's how it worked. Ships left Europe carrying manufactured goods, things like textiles, firearms, alcohol, and metal tools. These goods were taken to the West African coast and traded for enslaved people. Those people were then transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. This journey became known as the Middle Passage. Once in the Americas, enslaved Africans were sold and forced to work on plantations, mines, and farms. The goods produced there, such as sugar, tobacco, cotton, and later coffee, were shipped back to Europe, and the cycle continued. This was not a small operation. It was one of the most profitable trade systems in history. Entire economies depended on it. European merchants made enormous profits. Plantation owners in the Americas relied on enslaved labor to maintain production. Even industries like shipbuilding and insurance grew because of the trade. Human beings became commodities, bought, sold, and insured like cargo. That's one of the most important things to understand. This system didn't just tolerate slavery, it depended on it. And because of that, it became more efficient, more brutal, and more widespread over time. As demand for labor increased, so did the scale of capture and transportation. Some African leaders and traders participated in the system, capturing and selling people, often prisoners of war or individuals from rival communities. But it's important to understand the larger context. The demand was being driven from outside the continent. European buyers set the terms, controlled the shipping networks, and created the economic pressure that expanded the trade. Without that demand, the system would not have grown to the scale it did. Over time, European powers like Britain, Portugal, Spain, France, and the Netherlands competed for control of this trade. They built forts and trading posts along the West African coast. These weren't just trading centers. They were holding sites, places where captured Africans were kept, sometimes for weeks or months, before being forced onto ships. Conditions in these forts were harsh. Overcrowding, disease, and lack of sanitation were common. Many people died before they ever left the African continent. And yet, the system continued to expand, because for those profiting from it, the loss of human life was calculated as part of doing business. This is what schools often don't fully explain. The Atlantic slave trade was not chaotic or disorganized. It was structured. It was planned. And it was deeply tied to the rise of global capitalism. By the time the trade reached its peak in the 18th century, millions of Africans had already been taken from their homes. Communities were disrupted. Regions were destabilized. And a system built on human suffering had become a foundation of the global economy. The Middle Passage was the journey that carried enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. It is often described in just a few sentences, but in reality, it was one of the most brutal and dehumanizing experiences in human history. After being held in coastal forts, captured Africans were forced onto ships designed specifically for transporting human cargo. These ships were built for maximum capacity, not comfort or safety. People were packed tightly together, often lying side by side with barely enough room to move. In many cases, they were chained or shackled to prevent resistance. The journey could take anywhere from several weeks to a few months, depending on weather and distance. During that time, conditions on board were extremely harsh. There was little ventilation below deck. The air was hot, thick, and difficult to breathe. Sanitation was almost non-existent. People were forced to relieve themselves in the same spaces where they were confined. Disease spread quickly in these conditions. Illnesses like dysentery, smallpox, and infections were common. And because of the overcrowding, once sickness began to spread, It was almost impossible to contain. Food and water were limited. People were given just enough to keep them alive. Malnutrition and dehydration were constant threats. Violence was also a regular part of the journey. Crew members used force to control those on board. Any sign of resistance could be met with punishment. Some captives attempted to fight back. Others refused to eat as a form of resistance. In response, crews sometimes used extreme measures to force people to eat. Many did not survive the journey. Historians estimate that around 15 to 20% of those on board died during the Middle Passage. That means millions of people lost their lives before ever reaching land. In some cases, those who became too sick were thrown overboard, not as an act of mercy, but because they were seen as lost profit. There are documented instances where ship crews deliberately killed enslaved people in order to claim insurance money. This is one of the clearest examples of how deeply dehumanized the system had become. People were no longer seen as human beings. They were treated as cargo, as financial assets, as numbers on a ledger. And yet, even in these conditions, there were acts of resistance. Some people tried to revolt and take control of the ships. Others held on to their identities through language, songs, and shared memory. These moments of resistance are often overlooked, but they are an important part of the story, because they show that even in the most extreme conditions, people did not simply accept what was happening to them. The Middle Passage was not just a physical journey. It was also a psychological one. It marked the violent separation from home, family, and identity. For many, it was the point of no return. By the time the ships reached the Americas, those who survived were not the same people who had been taken from their homes. They had endured something that is difficult to fully capture in words. And for those waiting to buy them, the journey was only the beginning. For those who survived the Middle Passage, arrival in the Americas did not bring relief. It marked the beginning of a new phase of control. As ships reached ports in the Caribbean, South America, and North America, enslaved Africans were prepared for sale. This process was often referred to as seasoning. It involved cleaning, feeding, and sometimes attempting to make people appear healthier before they were sold, not for their well-being, but to increase their price. Once prepared, they were taken to markets or auctions. There, they were inspected by buyers. Men, women, and even children were examined physically, checked for strength, health, and signs of illness. In many cases, families who had already survived the journey together were separated at this stage, sold to different owners, sent to different regions, with no way of finding each other again. After being sold, enslaved people were transported to plantations, mines, or households. The majority were forced to work on plantations producing crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton. These were labor-intensive crops that required constant work. On plantations, the system was strict and controlled. Enslaved people worked long hours, often from sunrise to sunset, sometimes even longer during peak seasons. The work was physically demanding. Cutting sugar cane, harvesting cotton, or processing tobacco required endurance and strength. There was little rest, and conditions were harsh. Punishment was used to enforce control. If someone was seen as disobedient, slow, or resistant, they could be beaten or subjected to other forms of discipline. This was not random violence. It was part of a system designed to maintain authority and prevent rebellion. Laws were also created to support this system. In many colonies, legal codes defined enslaved people as property, not as citizens or individuals with rights. This meant they could be bought, sold, and inherited. Their status was permanent, and in most cases it was passed down to their children. This is another key difference from earlier forms of slavery. In the Atlantic system, slavery became hereditary. If you were born into it, you remained in it. And because it was tied to race, it created a rigid social hierarchy. At the top were European settlers and landowners. At the bottom were enslaved Africans and their descendants. In between, there were sometimes mixed groups with limited rights, but the system as a whole was designed to maintain inequality. Despite these conditions, enslaved people found ways to resist. Resistance did not always look like open rebellion. Sometimes it was subtle, working more slowly, breaking tools, maintaining cultural traditions in secret. Other times it was more direct. There were revolts and uprisings across the Americas. Some were small and quickly suppressed. Others had lasting impact. But resistance always carried risk. Because the system responded harshly to anything that threatened it. Even under constant pressure, enslaved Africans preserved elements of their cultures. Language, music, religion, and food traditions were adapted and passed down through generations. These cultural forms would go on to shape societies across the Americas in lasting ways. So while slavery was built on control and dehumanization, it did not completely erase identity. What developed instead was a complex mix of survival, adaptation, and resistance. By the time slavery was fully established across the Atlantic world, it had become more than just a labor system. It was a social and economic structure that influenced nearly every aspect of life. And it would take centuries and countless acts of resistance to begin to dismantle it. From the very beginning, enslaved Africans resisted. This is something that is often underemphasized. Slavery did not exist without opposition. It was constantly challenged, both quietly and openly. Some forms of resistance were small and everyday. Slowing down work, pretending to be ill, breaking tools. These actions may seem minor, but within the system they carried risk. And they disrupted productivity, which directly affected profits. Other forms of resistance were more visible. There were organized revolts on plantations and towns, and even on ships during the Middle Passage. Some of these uprisings were quickly suppressed. Others spread fear among slave owners and colonial governments. One of the most significant examples of large-scale resistance was the Haitian Revolution. Beginning in 1791, enslaved people in the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up against the system. Over time, the revolt grew into a full-scale revolution. It involved years of conflict, shifting alliances, and intense fighting. But in 1804, it achieved something unprecedented. It led to the creation of Haiti, the first independent black republic in the world, and the first nation established by formerly enslaved people. This event sent shockwaves across the Atlantic world. For slave-owning societies, it was seen as a threat. For enslaved people, it was proof that resistance could succeed. At the same time, opposition to the slave trade was growing in Europe and the Americas. Not just from enslaved people, but also from activists, writers, and religious groups. One of the most well-known figures in this movement was Olaudah Equiano. He had experienced slavery firsthand and later gained his freedom. Through his writing and public speaking, he exposed the realities of the trade to wider audiences. His autobiography became an important tool in changing public opinion. Movements to abolish the slave trade began to gain momentum. In 1807, Britain passed a law banning the transatlantic slave trade. Other countries followed with similar laws. But this is an important detail. Ending the slave trade did not mean ending slavery. The system itself continued for decades. Enslaved people were still held, bought, and forced to work. Full abolition came later, and it happened at different times in different places. In the British Empire, slavery was officially abolished in 1833. In the United States, it ended in 1865 after the American Civil War. In Brazil, one of the last countries to abolish slavery, it continued until 1888. Even after abolition, the effects did not disappear. Formerly enslaved people were often left without land, resources, or protection. Many systems of inequality remained in place. So while abolition marked the legal end of slavery, it did not immediately create equality. That process would take much longer, and in many ways, it is still ongoing. When the Atlantic slave trade ended, the system that supported it did not simply disappear. It changed form. That is one of the most important things often left out of the story. Because it's easy to treat slavery as something that existed in the past, something separate from the modern world. But many of the structures built during that time continued to shape societies long after abolition. Economically, the impact was massive. Wealth generated from enslaved labor helped build industries, banks, and institutions across Europe and the Americas. Plantations produced goods like sugar, cotton, and tobacco on a huge scale. These goods fueled global trade and contributed to the growth of modern capitalism. At the same time, Africa experienced long-term disruption. The removal of millions of people, many of them young and able-bodied, affected population growth, economic development, and political stability. Entire regions were destabilized over time. Social structures were altered. And in some cases, conflicts increased as different groups competed within the pressures created by the trade. After slavery ended, new systems were introduced that continued to limit freedom. In the United States, for example, laws and practices such as segregation and racial discrimination replaced slavery with other forms of control. One well-known example is the system of Jim Crow laws. These laws enforced separation and inequality for decades after slavery officially ended. In other parts of the world, similar patterns appeared. Even where laws changed, access to land, education, and economic opportunity remained unequal. This is part of the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade. It didn't just shape the past, it shaped the starting point for future generations. Culturally, the impact is also significant. Across the Americas, the influence of African traditions can still be seen today. Music, language, food, and religious practices all carry elements that were preserved and adapted over time. These cultural contributions are a direct result of survival and resilience under extreme conditions. But there is another part of the legacy that is less visible. It's the way this history is remembered or not remembered. In many education systems, the Atlantic slave trade is taught in a limited way, often reduced to key dates, basic facts, and short summaries, without fully exploring how the system operated, who benefited from it, and how its effects continue today. This can make it seem distant, disconnected from the present. But when you look more closely, the connections become clearer. Inequality, economic gaps, social divisions. These didn't appear suddenly. They developed over time, shaped by historical systems like the Atlantic slave trade. Understanding this doesn't change the past, but it does change how we see the present. Because history is not just about what happened. It's about what continues. And the story of the Atlantic slave trade is not just a closed chapter. It is part of a much longer story that is still unfolding. If you learned something new, Subscribe to Dark History Files for more untold Black history. And watch the next video to keep learning.